not going to go through the whole history of who is Coil and where did they come from and whatever, but feel free to ask any questions afterwards. And hopefully we're going to listen to something at the end. So this paper is going to examine the music of post-industrial electronic group Coil as fundamentally about and provoking of altered states of consciousness and embodiment. Formed by John Balance and Peter Christopherson out of the ashes of Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV, Coil was profoundly informed by the intersections of occult practices, surrealist aesthetics, queer sensibilities, and electronic technologies, resulting in a singular trajectory over the 23 years of their existence. It might not be exactly accurate, but 23 is a good number. The paper will focus on key musical recordings by Coil, but especially focused on alterations of embodiment consciousness, produced by both hallucinogenic substances and occult rituals. So we're going to start with a sort of love secret domain era and go on to talk about ELF a little bit, and then the track Baby Food, which is a very interesting one, and then particularly the Time Machines project. So that's that. Okay. Okay, and yeah, so I'm sort of situating the Time Machines project as an intensification of these kind of tendencies of, occult consciousness alteration, resulting in a form of drone music as literal time travel. And throughout I'll be looking at the relations between experimental music, occult ritual, and transformations of states of embodied sonic perception as a kind of technologically mediated magic. So Love Secret Domain is kind of like in a transitional period in Coil's work in proximity to rave and techno cultures, but also there's also examples of a sort of weird, almost jazz-like Lynchian mode of composition, and it's much closer in some tracks to the fringes of electronic dance music. One of my favorites on the album is the track Things Happen, which features Annie Anxiety, who was a sort of a singer, performance artist who was of Hispanic origin who was around at the time. It's the first time there was actually a female vocalist on a Coil track. And she does her best kind of Eartha Kitt, Carmen Miranda impression over one of Coil's most faux jazz compositions. It's also notable at this period there's a lot of references to chaos theory and catastrophe theory, and they sort of combined them. So they had this track about chaostrophe or original chaostrophe, which you can see illustrated there. And also a bit later on, they kind of were part of this project called Chaos and Expansion, which also featured a couple of other ensembles, including one with Charles Hayward, as well as a kind of a talk by Ilya Prigogine about chaos, about sort of order out of chaos, called Une fenêtre de connaissance, and they contributed their track Baby Food, which is also the first example of what they called sidereal sound that we will come back to. Okay, and after this period, this is a kind of a new phase in Coil's work, which is characterized by an emphasis on seriality, repetition, the lunar, the feminine, the inward, and sidereal sound. I mean, I wish I had time to play it for you, but I can only really manage to play one thing, and that will be Time Machines. Okay, it was also during this period that, of recording Love Secret Domain that the entity ELF made itself known. That's with PH. Essentially, after the drug-fueled recording sessions for this album, the members of Coil would return to the studio and discover sonic material that they not only had no memory of creating or recording, but they were certain was not created by them, but the action of some other force or entity that they named ELF. So when they discovered this stuff that they didn't know what it was, they said, oh, that was ELF, rather than us. Perhaps in reference to the machine elves described by Terence McKenna and others that become perceptible after ingesting DMT. The interference of ELF was profound enough that this entity would be credited as effectively a co-creator on 3 subsequent recording projects, most notably on the ELF versus Coil Worship the Glitch album, in which experimental compositions are constructed out of these errors or glitches directly attributed by Coil to ELF. To Coil, these were not mere technical accidents, but an opening to cosmic magical forces that will play a central role in future musical projects. So you could just say that they took so many drugs that they actually forgot what they recorded, or just whatever. But anyway, ELF was definitely an entity that was a presence in the sort of early 90s Coil. Okay. So it's also during this project that the idea of sidereal sound was formulated with multiple meanings. First of all, it was a reference to Austin Osman Spare's sidereal portraiture, which presented his subjects from an anamorphic perspective, so were quite literally sideways, and also aimed at bringing out other invisible spiritual qualities of the subjects. Sidereal sound would adopt this sideways approach to sonic composition, but also with reference to its astronomical meanings of the movement in time of distant stars. So sidereal sound means appertaining to the stars, but also means sideways, and that relates to the way Spare would tilt his portrait slightly sideways as if to reveal aspects of a person you wouldn't normally see. He would paint pictures of ghosts, elementals, and spirits, and these are sidereal portraits. We're trying to do the same with sound, to sort of skew it to the side, so as you can see things that you wouldn't normally perceive. It's a musical equivalent of catching a glimpse of something peripheral in your vision. That's from John Balance, and interviewed by David Keenan. While enjoying playing with the term as if it was a new digital compositional technology known only to Coil, Balance admitted that it was more an aesthetic compositional orientation than any singular sonic process. Like Burroughs or Spare, we see no difference between our philosophy, our lifestyle, and our art. We are what we do. What Spare did in art, we try to do through music. This is why we do sidereal sound. We try to produce strange geometries through sound so that it comes through sideways. We do it with technology, with 3D devices, phasers, out of phasers, all sorts of gizmos. There's no one particular box that does it. We all do it any possible way we can. So this idea of producing strange sonic geometries also, as I mentioned, resonates with Spare and other artists' attempts to capture forces and energies, or even entities in their artworks, which can be liberated when viewed by a spectator. There's also a fine line between this as an artistic approach and the sigil magic Spare also developed to capture a spiritual entity via an encoded form to then be able to harness its power for a specific aim. This is essentially the basis of contemporary chaos magic practices, however eclectic they may have become. Coil's sidereal approach to sound can therefore be seen as a creation of sonic sigils, which I know somebody else is talking about sometime today as well. The harnessing of various powers, energies, and forces, which can then be actualized by the attentive listener. This was done in one way in early work, like How to Destroy Angels, which is the literal sonic trace of a ritual to enhance male sexual energy, but rather differently in Coil's work of the 90s, with a broader range of collaborators, which had a much more mysterious, inward, and Gnostic approach, explicitly linked by Coil to the etheric, astral, and celestial dimensions. Ultimately, this would give rise to two major projects at the end of the 90s, the Equinox and Solstice series of EPs, ultimately collected together as Moon's Milk, and the two-album Music to Play in the Dark project, arguably one of the high points of Coil's musical output. However, before that, Coil would engage with drone-based experimentation of time machines that would inform all of his later 90s work. So now we come to Time Machines itself. Those are the albums I was talking about. The origins of Time Machines project are purported to be the discovery of the ability to produce similar effects to various forms of sacred music, not to mention mind-altering drugs, via repetitive drone sequences produced on analog modular synthesizers. This discovery was made by Drew McDowell, who then played the results to other Coil members with apparently the intended effects. They immediately started to enter into altered states in response to the music. This was in effect what Coil's various musical experiments had always been aiming for, to replicate in sonic forms the Gnostic effects of ritual experience and other sacred technologies like psychedelic drugs. The loop drones of Time Machines seemed especially efficacious in the aim of disrupting temporal experience, and a whole mythos developed around these recordings. Considered different enough from Coil's regular output as to be released simply as Time Machines by Time Machines, or Coil Presents Time Machines, each drone piece was linked to a specific mind-altering chemical formula, whether DMT, psilocybin, or telepathine, according to research into the resonance between the textures of a mind-altering experience made available via each piece and the associated chemical substance. By research, I mean listening to the track and taking drugs. Drones both feature in a variety of sacred musics from Tibet to Morocco and indigenous Australian cultures, and were also experimented with by minimalist composers, notably Lamont Young. The latter had the following to say about them. The idea behind a drone state of mind is that you set up a pattern of harmonically related impulses. The resulting impulses make a periodic composite waveform that flows through the ear and is relayed through the neurons up to the cerebral cortex, where it's a constant sound. These patterns become continuous. For Lamont Young, the sonic and psychic process would lead to unexpected flights of the imagination, or in other words, psychedelic experiences made available via sound alone. A visual analog might be found in the phenomenon of flicker films, and we heard about flicker yesterday, which in an analogous way reduce the resources of film to pure alternations of light intensity, and likewise have been claimed to produce altered states of consciousness. These techniques also apply to Brian Geison's Dream Machine that used the simple technology of a turntable with a light source filtered through a rotating cardboard cylinder with holes to provoke altered state of awareness in a markedly similar manner to sonic drones. The loop nature of drones means it's essentially a form of feedback generated by highly organized sonic vibrations, so that the brain and indeed the whole organism resonates at an unfamiliar frequency in a kind of open feedback loop between machine and organism. This is quite literally recursion in that drones are repetitions of series of near identical tones. However, this process is unpredictable and self-organizing and not at all about control and ordering. Rather, it's a literal form of noise used as a disruptive agency. As Bateson or Deleuze might say, drones are differential repetitions that make a difference in an analogous manner to chants or mantras. For Coil, the drones and time machines had the power to disrupt time itself. As John Balance put it, time machines were supposed to cure you of time. In the sense that time is an affliction, everything is speeding up and there's no time and everything is compressed. Your time isn't your time anymore. It belongs to someone else and they pay you for it, and then suddenly you find you haven't got it. So you borrow it from somewhere else. Time machines was an attempt to create a space where people can stop and have gaps. This seems a surprisingly sort of Marxist critique of wage labor, all the more so coming from someone who never had any kind of regular job in their entire life. But reading between the lines, it's also highly expressive of a twin context of Coil relocating from London to Weston-super-Mare and Balance's worsening alcoholism. The affliction of time he refers to may be less about working life than the temporality of addiction, which, as described by Burroughs, Lowry, Fitzgerald, and later Deleuze, forecloses the present in a perpetual deferral, a hardened present always oriented towards a conditional future of a next drink or hit, the teleology of a last drink, or as Ministry might say, just one fix, as Deleuze mentions in Porcelain and Volcano. He doesn't talk about Ministry, but I just added that. Porcelain and Volcano being a very apt description of Balance's combination of vulnerability and explosive intensity at this particular phase of Coil's evolution. So Time Machines is not merely a kind of a break from the rhythms of capitalist subjectivity, whether in the form of work or addiction, but also a veritable form of time travel, referring not only to the powers of sacred music, but also the perennial interest of Coil in John Dee, and Edward Kelly and Enochian magic and other such practices. Not only was the cover of a release designed to resemble John Dee's obsidian scrying mirror, but it was also accompanied by stickers which were so many elements of John Dee's monadic figure that incorporates all the signs of the zodiac. This is also a figure appropriated by Coil's later incarnations, especially when they began shortly after this period to engage in live performances, including of the Time Machines material. As with, so Time Machines project had the explicit aim of stopping or leaping out of time, a quality it shared with sacred musics. So sacred music takes you out of yourself, stops time, takes you somewhere else. There's a real sense of non-corporeality, the same with certain aspects of the psychedelic experience, escaping time, playing around with affinity. As indicated by the track titles, drug and psychedelic research was important to this project, but not as a means of composing the music as it had been for Love's Secret Domain. Instead, drugs came afterwards once the music had already been recorded, as a way of identifying the psychic texture of each track as a kind of post-production calibration of the music with the mind alterations provoked by specific chemical compounds. There was a definite sense between us that we knew when timelessness was starting to appear, but drones weren't just drones for the sake of it. You could feel a slippage and a blurring of the edges. Okay, and there's a sense that, you know, these kind of tracks sort of basically took on a kind of a life of their own, which they then sort of kind of proceeded to sort of investigate. There was a bit of a difference between them because Drew McDowell, who initially discovered these kind of drones, he didn't want them to have his drug names because he felt that, you know, the power of the music was enough in itself. It didn't need to be associated with some other kind of chemical, but, you know, that's not what John Balance or Peter Christopherson thought, so they were quite interested in making these kind of calibrations and connections. So yeah, so unlike this previous ferocious psychedelic experimentation, I've already gone on to that. I mean, even one of the drugs I mentioned is an absolutely unobtainable drug, so they clearly never actually tried it, but I think it's also part of the whole mythos around the Time Machines project to align each drone piece to a different chemical formula. So, however skeptical one might be about the idea of experiencing Coil's time machines as literally facilitating a form of time travel, in another sense, all time-based arts are potentially interventions into the experience of linear chronological time, as can be seen in everything from Deleuze's engagement with modern cinema as the time image, to the restaging of past audio and visual recordings via sampling practices, to the retro-futurist loops of Afrofuturism, that not only attempt to imagine alternative liberatory futures, but also revision pasts of slavery and genocide. And this is especially evident in the multimedia art group Black Quantum Futurism, for example, who extend this temporal revisioning into literal time travel via workshops and other activities. So Coil not entirely alone on this idea that through art you can arrive at something like time travel. Yeah, so I was kind of trying to loop this into the idea of amethyst sievers, which I put in the title, which initially I thought were just some kind of crystal or something, but actually it's a kind of mushrooms, not especially known for their psychedelic kind of properties, but they appear in various songs by Coil, and I guess I was just trying to loop this around to some idea of the art of deception, but I'm not sure that I've really succeeded in doing that. But they appear in the song, which is very much about escaping the limits of the kind of the Oedipal and the human via confrontation of death, also facilitated by these mushrooms as well as by relations with various kinds of birds. So, okay, so if I've got a couple of minutes.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, so yes, so I thought that the best thing we could do is just to have a brief experience of time machines. So we'll just listen for a couple of minutes, and trigger warning: this may alter your state of consciousness. The images are nothing really to do with it, it's just something to entertain your eyes. So you're listening to that in a darkened room for somewhat over an hour, with or without the aid of various substances, and I think you have an interesting experience. So thank you very much.
there any questions from the audience?
Do we know anything about Coil's work with Elf outside of music composition and creation? Like their work with Elf in ritual, or like, do we know anything else about that relationship?
Not really, because I mean, I think also there's a kind of a bit of a trickster playfulness about Coil, so they kind of like to invoke certain things and titles that are quite suggestive of things without actually being, you know, too kind of specific, I guess. So yeah, so I mean, they were definitely experiencing something that they were convinced was, you know, an entity that was, you know, engaging in the compositional process, and they named it Elf. But beyond that, I couldn't really tell you very much. But it did, you know, it did really feed into quite a lot of, you know, future work. So.
Any others? Thank you.
Thanks.